Sorry?
I'll distribute the handouts.
Okay. The hard work of distributing all these handouts.
Everyone has a handout, I guess.
Yes.
Okay. So we are now streaming as well. Okay, just even for the general audience.
I'm not going to hide behind that lecture.
You're not? Okay.
I don't think I need.
Is this a good spot for you? Because I have a camera right here. And
Oh,
there's a
what?
microphone here as well.
Where-
Would that work for you?
Where am I supposed to be?
Somewhere near the microphone.
Yeah, okay.
I mean, can we use the microphone?
Why don't we just take?
It's relatively moving. Yeah.
Yeah, but I can't hold it and my hand as well. So
Let's do this. Would this work for you, Anna? Right here, I think this would be
sure.
good.
Okay.
Okay, so before we start, I'd just like to say hello to what seems to be, in a way, a very modest but first incarnation of a first sub-incarnation of formal semantics in historical linguistics, at least the intersection. And this workshop is obviously about logical vocabulary in a sense that we want to understand functional meanings and how those meanings change as opposed to lexical meanings, which is really what I think what we could call less formal semantics in historical linguistics has been called, with notions such as semantic bleaching and grammaticalization, perhaps more generally. So we hope to bring together some talks that try to address historical issues, but in a very formal semantic way. And it gives me no greater pleasure than to introduce Professor Anna Szabolcsi from New York University, who has been absolutely instrumental in a lot of our work collectively. And she will be talking today about disjunctive and conjunctive particles meeting their negative concord relatives. Anna, thank you.
Thank you very much. So I apologize. I lost my voice a week ago, and some of it has come back, but not too much. I also have to say immediately that I'm not a historical linguist, and I haven't done any historical research on this topic, although my colleague Katalin Kish did some historical work, and I quote her, and I can tell you something that she found, but I have absolutely no historical contribution of my own. So what I'm going to talk about relates to two topics. One is negative concord, and the other is particle constructions of the paired or reiterated type, which in English would be exemplified by neither nor or either or, for example. I will talk less about negative concord because the theories are complex and complicated, but I will have to start with that and then move vigorously on to the particle constructions, which are interesting and so far as I know, neither for Hungarian nor for other languages have these data or similar data being described. So, so negative concord languages come basically in, are thought to come in two flavors, the strict and non-strict negative concord types. So Russian is a strict negative concord language. Whenever you have an N-word, which is literally translated, whether it's the correct analysis, as no one or nothing, it always co-occurs with the sentential negation marker. Non-strict negative concord languages like Italian, or specifically of the Italian type, have the property that when the N-words, for instance, nessuno in Italian, occur in preverbal position, they do not co-occur with the sentential negation unless the intended meaning is double negation, whereas in post-verbal position, they pretty much behave like the strict negative concord cases. So, Hungarian, as was established by the Hungarian linguist Balázs Surányi, is a hybrid negative concord language. It has both strict and non-strict negative concord constructions, and this raises various theoretical questions that I will not talk about now, because that's a different topic. So I have a paper on negative concord that I'm just referring to here. What you might want to bear in mind before we move on to the particle constructions is that in the strict negative concord version, I'm assuming that the n-words occur in the specifier of the sentential negation marker, and it's an actual real negation, much like in English and in other languages. In the non-strict negative concord version, that is Italian-like, I'm essentially following an analysis by Gennaro Chiara in his 2013 book. Chiara postulates a phonetically null functional head, essentially, which he calls neg, but it's really not a negation in any way. He just calls it neg. And negative concord items occur in the specifier of his neg head and undergo various agreement processes, and there is a totally abstract non-syntactic negation that he says is adjoined at the edge of the maximal projection above this. So what I'm claiming is that in Hungarian there is an overt particle, in this case shem, that functions exactly like Chiara's neg, and I will be arguing, in fact, that so this is a focus-sensitive particle. This in either positive or non-locally negated contexts, it's the particle ish, which literally translates as two or even, and in negative concord contexts, I mean in the context of local negation, it pans out as shem, whose etymology is similar to neck on the one hand and ute on the other, and so all these combinations of a negation and apparently a conjunction, although I will claim it's not a conjunction. Anyway, so this is sufficient background, so let me invite you to move to the next page that starts talking about particles. So in 1 and 2, I have an example of a sentence with strict negative concord, Senki nem aludt, no one not slept. So here Senki is followed by not. And the non-strict negative concord version is Senki sem aludt, where this shem particle associates with Senki, and there is no sentential negation. So the interesting observation that I don't think anybody has made about Hungarian, and I'm not aware of other languages that do these, there are two distinct particle constructions that correspond to these. So Senki nem aludt is paralleled by the same particle shem preceding its host. So it's nor koti nor mori. So this construction that is in the same row as Senki nem aludt must co-occur with preverbal sentential negation. So it's a strict negative concord construction. The other construction has the particle shem following the host, so it's koti shem mori shem, and when it's preverbal, it is not followed by the sentential negation, exactly like Senki shem is not followed by the sentential negation. So, so these are the two particle constructions that I will be focusing on, and the interesting thing about these is that they are not alone in the language, but there are other particle constructions that pattern in the same way. So I'm hoping that these data will be relevant to people who are interested in particle constructions, regardless whether they are particularly interested in negative concord. Okay, so the two constructions, so I will call these the particle precedes host and particle follows host construction, which is a completely descriptive statement without analysis regarding what the particle is doing. Okay, so there are at least three differences between these two constructions. In the particle precedes host construction, that must be a reiterated particle construction. So putting aside some complications in 3a, the really good example that shows this is 3b. So not slept nor Kate is absolutely totally ungrammatical. Right? In contrast, if you have the particle follows host construction, that does not need a pair. It can come paired, but it doesn't need. So not slept Kate nor is perfectly good. Right? So in 4b. So there are other particle constructions that share one of these two behaviors. So Hungarian in 5, Hungarian, in addition to the Shem, Kati, Shem, Mori, nor Kate, nor Mary construction, you have the reiterated mind particle, which I translate as all, because this is also the same morpheme that functions as the floating quantifier all, and so it's as good as as anything else. So all Kate, all Mary means Kate as well as Mary. So it's both Kate and Mary, but it's strictly distributive construction. You have the either or exclusive construction, so that's vagy, Kati, vagy, Mori. And you have a free choice or unconditional construction where akár is a free choice particle. So all of these are particle precedes host constructions that require to be reiterated. So mind Kati by itself is as ungrammatical as anything can possibly be. So the particle follows host construction, which with the negative concord is Kotishem, Morishem, can be reiterated, but doesn't have to be. So, so Mary didn't sleep, not slept, Kotishem, Kate didn't sleep either, is perfect. And so corresponding to this is the construction with ish, which is two. So Mary slept and Kate slept too is also okay. So these are the constructions that can pair up, but don't have to be. Okay. So I'm going to propose that in the particle precedes host construction, where which must be reiterated, the particle, in fact, is a quantifier internal particle, even though these quantifiers, as we will see, can be big, can be sentence size, but it's still, the particle is inside the quantifier effectively. It marks each member of the expression that make up the quantifier. In contrast, in the particle that follows the host, the particle is outside the construction. It's a head on the clausal spine, much like ish, too, has always been assumed in the literature, in Hungarian, English, and so on and so forth, and much like Kierkegaard's neg is head on the clausal spine. And essentially that explains why this doesn't have to be reiterated. So two of these can team up to form a seemingly reiterated construction, but it's just by itself a completely self-sufficient thing. So the second interesting difference between the two constructions is that neither of these, so now I'm talking about cases where they come reiterated, whether obligatorily or not, that they don't need to have a medial connective, but they both can have one. But the connectives are different. So in the particle precedes host construction, the particle is pedig. So pedig, I will say what this is, and in the particle follows host is the particle is ish, whose dictionary equivalent is and. I argued it's only a pair former in Hungarian. So this jibes with the fact that this is two separate sentences, either elided or not. But so what is pedig? So pedig is a fairly, not etymologically, but functionally a fairly close relative of a in Russian and Southern Slavic. So sometimes it's, in some other uses, a in Slavic and pedig in Hungarian is kind of an adversative, contrastive particle. Here it isn't. So in this construction, there is a completely parallel use of a in, at least in Russian that I know, which what it does is you have a question under discussion. Suppose the question is, where are the kids? And you answer with a set of partial answers. And a in Slavic and pedig in Hungarian marks, I'm now giving the last partial answer. With this, it will be completed. So if you have this, where are the kids, you would say, Pat is at school, Chris is at home, Kim, pedig, or a in Slavic, is at the gym. So this means that both you completed your list of partial answers and also that you gave all the partial answers. So for instance, you can't trail off your intonation, kind of just say, so you could just say, Kate is here, Pat is there, Chris is da-da-da, and you trail off, which indicates that, I could continue, but I don't. If you add pedig, you can't do that. That means that it's a completed list and it's actually the full answer given in terms of partial answers. So this is what happens in Hungarian for some mysterious reason. This pedig is in second position. In the Hungarian doesn't have second position phenomena. I don't know why it is. In Slavic it isn't. So for instance, in Russian you would say, sometimes it rains, sometimes it snows. It would be to sneg, a to dождь. That would not be in second position. I have no idea why this. I have nothing to say about it. So the third interesting thing that distinguishes the two particle constructions is that the first, the necessarily reiterated one, always has a corresponding quantifier word construction. So you have the negative, the n-word quantifiers, shenki, shemi, shehol, no one, nothing, nowhere. You have the universals, everyone, everything, everywhere with mind. You have the existentials or indefinites, volaki, volami, volahol, someone, sometimes. So you have the free choice items. So on the other hand, ish, which is the little brother of Shem, does not form quantifier words. So in contrast to mindenki, ishki doesn't exist. Or so ki is the indeterminate pronoun. Okay. So I want to note that in my quantifier particles article, I observed that where a number of languages, Japanese among them, have the same morpheme for both forming quantifier words and reiterated particle constructions, and the additive constructions, likewise Malayalam, likewise Sinhala, likewise probably a zillion others. Hungarian splits up this territory between two. Hi, I'm afraid we started earlier because the first speaker bailed out. So, yes. I'm sorry. I'm on example 12 right now. Yeah. So, Shimoyama briefly notes that she thinks that the mo in Daramo and the mo in whatever Akira mo are not the same because they don't interfere with each other in intervention constructions, but she doesn't really say how they are different. But so the fact that Hungarian splits up this territory between two segments in such a way that they overlap, and in fact, when they overlap, they are, at least in the end, they are synonymous between Mind and Ish. In a sense, jibes with Shimoyama's hunch that those two mo's are not the same. She doesn't ever talk about the momo construction. So, in a sense, what I'm doing here is trying to. So, in my quantifier particle paper, I talked about the ish type of the particles, and when I talked about Hungarian, I mean, it wasn't a Hungarian-focused paper, but I'm now trying to do justice also to the other part of this. So, what is the analysis that I'm proposing has been kind of anticipated by what I already said. So on the next page, so I'm claiming that ish, literally translated as two or even, is a head on the clausal spine. So in koti ish mori ish, weigh 100 pounds, kilos. The junction head ish connects two clauses, in each of which ish is the two style head on which attracts a focus accented expression to its specifier because it's a focus sensitive construction. And then to get the reiterated construction, you can do elision in either the first or the second junct. Yeah, I just want to say, I always talk about paired constructions here, but these could be tuples for any n. So these are not binary constructions. So in contrast, I'm claiming that Mind, the other guy, is what I called is a quantifier internal particle. So Mind koti is one constituent, and Mind mori is one constituent, and together they form something that is like a Mind koti mori constituent. So I'm claiming that when you have, so here it's easier to illustrate with a triple rather than a pair. So if you have Mind X, Mind Y, Mind Z, this is the same thing as mindenki, i.e. everyone in a domain that consists of X, Y, and Z. And likewise for the for the negative concord version or the free choice version or the yeah. So the first speaker bailed out, and we started earlier. So
Thank you.
okay. I don't know why the quantifier wants to appear on each of the things that make up the domain. So if somebody tells me, I would be grateful, but I don't know. So the semantics seems fairly straightforward. I want to mention, though, that so these examples, like where I assimilate these constructions to everyone and no one and anyone, might suggest that it's necessarily a quantifier size thing, but it isn't. So so I have in 15 and 16, I have examples with ellipses, but it's easy to illustrate these with English, because English does so they practically the same thing happens in English. So you can definitely say neither John nor Mary, but you can also say neither the tall nor the short people were inconvenienced, right? And so, yeah. So what we see here is that, and you can put it in any other position where it's clear that it's a case-marked noun that is missing. So you could say, I saw neither the tall nor the short people. So it's people in the accusative that is missing. So, and this is an particular ellipsis construction. This is not moved out because it would not. It's not the kind of thing that you move out. Also, this construction tolerates the gap between the gap being within a word. So you can say neither the right nor the left-handed people. So clearly, handed people is not moved out of these jumps. So Vidal-Valmala describes this construction, obviously mainly in connection with English, as what he calls non-focus pivot right node raising construction. He uses right node raising totally as a descriptive term. Non-focus pivot means that the shared element that appears is not focus accented, but the element before the shared element, the pivot, bears the focus accent. And this construction has a very different property than the focus pivot node raising construction. And this Valmala paper is unfortunately unpublished. It's a beautiful paper. It was pointed out to me by Aniko Liptak, and it's a great clarification in this domain. Okay, so very briefly, I want to just say what kind of semantics I'm assuming. So I'm assuming that especially so because negative concord constructions, as well as others like weak NPI constructions, have in recent years, or at least about 20, been analyzed as existentials within the scope of either negation or merely decreasing operator. Likewise for free choice expressions. So these have to be, the whole construction itself has to be an existential or disjunctive construction. So the question arises here is, so how come you have the additive meanings in the two or either instances of the construction. And here, the basic intuition is what Moreno proposed in his analysis of Mo as a double exhaustification construction, which says that you take an existential or a disjunction, you doubly exhaustify, and you get an additive or universal interpretation. I carve up the contribution of the particles differently than Moreno did, because the Hungarian data involve NPI and free choice items that Japanese and these other languages apparently don't. But it's kind of, just working back and reassigning bits of meanings in the same spirit as what Moreno suggested. Let me so very briefly, in 1 second, just make a connection to a historical perspective. So given the yes-person cycle, it is often so strict and non-strict negative concord systems are often thought to be successive stages in a cycle. So one doesn't only follow the other, but also replaces the other for various reasons. So I didn't do any historical work on this topic, but my colleague Katalin Kesh does, and I have a long quote, just in case you are, not to read it here, but so in case people want to find out. So the non-strict negative concord construction is, in general, in Hungarian, not the particle construction, is more recent than the strict one. But these have been, coexisting happily for 600 years. They are not fighting. One is not replacing the other. And my analysis of the particle construction jibes with that. These are two different constructions. They have they could, for some reason, one could force out the other, but they really don't have a reason. Their existence is not motivated by the other becoming deficient. So, I'm hoping that this is useful for people that work on particle constructions in general, for people who look at negative concord. And yeah, that's it.
Thank you very much. Should we want to maybe allow a couple of minutes for questions? Or?
Yeah, so maybe we should share the secret with people who came later. So we are kind of, Chiara and I are splitting up the time that we had for 3 slots, and we will.
For 11:30 for your talk.
Yeah, but so these talk. I'm so sorry. So these talk slots were very short, and it would have sounded stupid to sit around, not doing anything. I'm sorry. So anyway, so Chiara talks about neck, which is a somewhat related thing, and so we will also have a shared discussion after her talk. But I'm happy to talk with you independently of. Yeah.
Thanks. So we'll have a shared discussion.
No, I mean, if people have
yes, please.
Questions relating to the Hungarian, I'm happy to answer them. And other than that, there's a chance to unite Hungarian and Latin in the discussion.
Any questions at this point? Maybe a quick one from Chiara to the students, and we can have a shared discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you. Just wait for Chiara.
Maybe if you can bring up her slides.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, we have our second speaker. It's a great pleasure to have Chiara Gianollo from University of Bologna to talk about the synchrony and the diachrony of the multifunctional particle, so much in the spirit of the previous talk, but this time on Latin, especially nec.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Moreno, for offering us this opportunity to discuss things we really like. So, there's more synchrony than diachrony in my paper for the simple reason that introducing the data will take long for the synchronic part. What I will tell you about diachrony is how I think a development we will see actually takes place. So which mechanism takes us to this development. I will consider this particle, nec, which has a lot of translations and not furthermore, I forgot, neither, not even. And already these multiple translations point to the fact that this element was a highly multifunctional one, which became extremely successful in the Romance languages, as we will see. Nec is the shortened form of neque. I will treat both particles as functional equivalents because this is what you see at least until late Latin, when neque almost everywhere disappears. I think that this case study is interesting for our understanding of the diachronic development and the syntax-semantics interface because it may shed light on the relations between various meaning components conveyed as well as their syntactic implementation. And my idea is basically to use it to address the challenge posed by multifunctionality to compositional isomorphism. So if we believe that the parts and their composition should give us one meaning, then multifunctionalism sets a challenge because we see different meanings in the use in the context. So after a short introduction, I will go into the functions of nec, and then I will provide an analysis for the syntactic semantic structure of the particle, and I will give you some information on the diachronic development of a use that's particularly important for my work, which is the focus-sensitive particle use, and then I will conclude. Okay, so the etymology of this element is quite transparent. As mentioned, the full form is neque, and if you cut the last syllable, you will have nec. That is, we have a negative morpheme, which is the Indo-European inherited morpheme ne, which you find everywhere where something is negatively marked in Indo-European. And then you have the enclitic conjunction que, and this conjunction used to combine with other particles. We have a very similar pair, atque, atk. And also, again, with this shortening. This element is enclitic, so it's postpositive, senatus populusque or terra marique, so it follows the second or last conjunct, because again, it's not a binary structure. So why did I say that it is very successful diachronically? Well, it is because all correlative negations in Romance originate from this element. French ni, Spanish ni, Italian ne. Romanian is the only language to continue the long form neque in niche. But if you have a correlative negation in Romance, which you do, you continue this element. Another very important outcome for Romance is the fact that this element is one building block of concord indefinites, so of n words. We know very well that n words are these narrow scope indefinites that participate in the negative system of Romance languages. They are not necessarily negatively marked, so n just stands for the first, sound of many of those. But you have Spanish nada, which is nata, so born, and the n is not a negative morpheme. If, however, we have a negative morpheme in this indefinite, it will come from nec, and not from the negative marker no, for instance. So this was what triggered my interest initially. So why did this particle end up being a morphological component of these indefinites and not the plain sentential negative marker no? If you think about, I don't know, negative indefinites like nemo, no one, in this case, we did have the Indo-European negative morpheme ne, so the plain negation. So the question is, why did Romance languages behave differently? So in Old French, you see it clearly that French underwent another cycle, so it now has positive indefinites, personne, rien, but in Old French we find ne, on, nessun. In Spanish we find ninguno, in Italian we find nessuno, which however is etymologically more complicated than the old Italian version ne uno, ni uno, where the etymology is very transparent, not one. So this is a background question for me. As for the functions of NEC, I base on work by Italian colleagues Anna Landini, Paolo Coccetti, who recognize a multifunctionality for NEC. At least 3 functions may be distinguished. The one I call discourse structuring particle, and not, or furthermore, it is not the case that. And this is used at the beginning of new textual units, as we will see. Then we have the correlative version, neither nor. And then we have a standalone focus particle use. So where the particle occurs not in pairs, basically, alone, and it has an additive meaning, not either, and also a scalar meaning that appears later, not even. And I think this is particularly interesting to explain this use in indefinites. There is also an archaic NEC I will not mention, but if you read very archaic Latin text, you will find this different particle, which is probably etymologically different. Now, all the uses, the 3 uses we saw, derive from a basic meaning and not. And you immediately see that this is the mirror image of the linear order, right? So you would have a not and or nen, as Larry Horn calls it. And we know that these kind of particles are very rarely, if at all, lexicalized in languages, because exactly as the combination of negation and universal quantifier, because they are, their meaning can be obtained by implicature from the simple existential, or disjunction in this case. So, what we also see differently from the case we just saw with Anna is that NEC in Latin, and you can see it in the standalone use, for instance, or in the discourse structuring particle use, is well, it's semantically negative. This is what you also assumed for your version of the particle in the end, if I understand. So they belong to the negative concord system, but each of them provides a semantic negative operator. Maybe. Okay.
Yep.
Okay. We see that. So for Latin, it is quite clear that when you use this particle, you have sentential negation. So this is, according to Cicera's model of negative systems, I argue that this element bears a semantic feature next. So it corresponds to the instruction to insert a semantic negative operator in the logical structure. I will also argue that in 2 and 3, this NEC is sensitive to focus, so it is a focus-sensitive negation, and in the function in 3, it overlaps with another particle that we find in Latin, a discontinuous one, ne quidem, which I will just mention at the end to show you that at some point NEC takes over the functions also of this ne quidem particle. Now, let's have a look at the examples for the functions of NEC. So, as a discourse connector, it introduces a full clause which belongs to a new discourse unit. This is not always easy to say when you analyze text, but I took, for instance, as criterion the fact that you change the subject. So really, the syntactic subject is different than the subject in the previous clause, and there is no parallelism between the 2 units. So have a look at the example in 2. I have a version with glosses, but it would be difficult to read. So here there's 2 clauses being combined. Of all the Britons, the inhabitants of Kent are by far the most civilized. Neque. So, and they do not differ, in fact, from the Gallic manner of life. So in this case, you have a first conjunct which is positive, and the second conjunct that introduces further information and introduces also a semantic negation. The other case is something similar. All ships got into Britain at around noon, and no enemy was spotted there. So again, a first unit which is positive and a second unit which is negative. This would be the gloss version if you want for the discussion. The correlative negation is subject to a stricter parallelism requirement. So we have an example in 5. I have a headache. Actually, literally, my head hurts, and I cannot hear, and I cannot see enough with my with my eyes. Here we see propositional entities being coordinated, and as you see, it's not binary. You can have as many as you want. This is very clear in the example number 6, where apparently nominal phrases are coordinated, but we will see probably the syntactic structure is more complicated. So neither a tiny nose, nor a pretty foot, nor black eyes, and it is used as a rhetorical device. Notice that also in this function we can have polarity switch. So we can have the first conjunct with a positive polarity value and the second conjunct negative. So for instance in example 7, this one serves his father and the father doesn't know. So we have a contrast, so and the father, but also but the father, and the first element is positive, the second one is negative. These cases are borderline between a discourse function and a correlative function in a way, but this kind of parallelism, suo patri pater, takes me to treat them as correlative cases. B omnia habeo neque quicquam habeo. I have everything and yet I don't have anything. This is something that you couldn't do in Italian with one of those correlative particles. So ho tutto ne o niente with the polarity switch would be completely ungrammatical. You would have to use the full version of the conjunction and of the negation. So ho tutto e non ho niente. Let's come to the last function, which is the focus particle use. This is what I call the standalone focus particle use, in the sense that you only have one element, which, however, typically is attached to a constituent which is less than closal. Yeah? And we have two meanings, as mentioned. We will see that the additive meaning is prior to the scalar meaning, so not either or not even. In cases like 8, the cohesion, so because you could, ask yourself, how do you distinguish this use from the first use? Because you still have one particle. My criterion was the following. If there are other elements which take care of the discourse cohesion, and if there is a clear focus feeling of contrast, for instance, then I treat it as a focus particle. So for instance, in this case, we have the particle eta, thus, at the very beginning of this discourse unit, and this is what, organizes the discourse. And then we have the explicit mention of a first alternative, primis repulsis, as the first forces had been sent back, repulsed. Then you have the mention of the further alternative, nec ipse, neither he managed, to sustain the cohorts so we have an explicit mention of an alternative, and then the alternative on which the attention is focused is preceded by this nec element. These are examples of scalar uses. As mentioned, this use is found later, although occasionally you also find it in early text, but I really had to look hard. So an example of an early text is Plautus in 9. Not even salvation could save us, with an etymological play. And 10, not even Solomon, so a great king, is dressed as elegantly as one of these lilies. And then you have a late example where you see the correlation with the negative indefinite. No one is pure, not even an infant. And here you have the typical scalar use where you take the most obvious candidate for your property. So for purity, a baby, not even this baby is going to be pure. We know that many of the negative scalar focus particles which we find in Indo-European languages also are the same element, as a correlative negation. So, and we know the Spanish ni, for instance, still retains both functions, whereas for Italian and French, only the correlative negation is retained, and for this focus particle use, another form was grammaticalized, nemmeno or neanche, or neppure, so many different ones that show you that this particle had to be renewed in the daughter languages. So, interest summary and then my proposal. In all its uses, NEC can combine with constituents of various sizes, and it doesn't show any categorical restriction. So, syntactically, it is very flexible. In all its uses, it introduces a real semantic negative operator, which can take sentential scope, and in all its uses, it contributes an additive component. The alternatives it operates on are provided by the broader surrounding discourse in the case of the first use, or by more local antecedents in the case of the second and third function. So the proposal is that across functions, NEC shares a homogeneous internal syntactic structure that corresponds to its basic components, additivity and negation, and the various uses then are derived by the interaction with the context and by the kind of alternatives that become relevant and the way they factor in the meaning. This is influenced by the structural position of the particle, which influences the form these alternatives take. Are they discourse alternatives? Are they propositional alternatives? And the way they are retrieved. And this we see is relevant for the difference between the additive and the scalar reading. So this is the structure I propose for the, it is very parallel. There's only a labeling difference which we will try to reduce in a second. So the idea is that the bimorphismic structure of the participle is transparently mapped into the syntax. So we have a negative operator projection, if you want a neg phrase, but this is a real semantic operator projecting. And then we have well, for the discourse structural particle, for the moment I am assuming a real conjunction, whereas for the correlative and focus particle use, I am assuming that this element is the head of a focus projection. So both the correlative negation and the focus, the standalone focus particle have the same structure and are actually focus particles, which can take any kind of complement, whereas the discourse structuring particle typically takes a full clause, a CP, as a complement. I follow here Petra Hendricks, who proposed that English either, neither, both behave as focus sensitive particles, and that has been followed by other authors more recently. How then would correlation work? Well, here I adopted junction phrase proposed by the Deacon and used by Szabolcsi in their work, and also by Moreno, Sauerland. The only well, the big issue we have in Latin is that in this case, this junction phrase would always be phonetically empty, so never realized. And this happens also in Italian. If you want, I can go back to this in the discussion. So we would have nec being head of this functional structure, introducing the two conjuncts, but the junction head is never openly realized. And for Italian, where I have native judgment, I can say it would be fully ungrammatical, although not everyone agrees. So this is a big difference with respect to what...
So what is fully ungrammatical? Just give the...
Ne Gianni e ne Francesco. Okay. Also, o ne Francesco, completely not. So, as you see, these two functional elements which combine in this lexicalization are basically subcategorematic functional shells. What does it mean? They apply to any category, and they can take various types then of focus associates, and the category remains transparent for categorical selection from above. So if you take a nominal phrase, this will behave as a nominal phrase for argument selection, for instance. Actually, I said it can take any syntactic element. If we will study these constructions better, if we will understand a bit more about ellipses in Latin, probably they will turn out to be elliptical constituents of a predicational which at least reach a VP level. So, for instance, in this example, neque obscuris personis nec pavis incautis res agetur, in this case, the predicational unit would be subject to ellipsis in the first conjunct under parallelism. Now, this syntactic flexibility is a factor in multifunctionality because the structural position of attachment influences the semantic pragmatic interpretation, as mentioned in terms of the form that the alternatives take, which influences in turn the way they are retrieved from the surrounding context. I have an open issue, which I mentioned. I also mentioned how I am trying to solve it. I provided you two structures, one with the conjunction for the discourse structuring use and one with the focus particle. This would mean that you are forced to an ambiguity approach, to assuming two entries in your lexicon. It would be nice to have only one entry and to have complete syntactic flexibility. We would have to reduce the discourse structuring use to a focus-sensitive use somehow. I think it is possible if you apply a typology of discourse relations. So you see that this element always introduces coordinating and not subordinating discourse relations, and it leads to a switch in the topic of discontinuation. So we could say that it leads to a distinctness requirement, as Tsevat and Yaziskaya have argued for English "and" when it is used as a one-place connector, they say, but in fact it takes as a second element the whole preceding discourse. And in this case, we could say it is an information focus particle in the discourse, as the translation furthermore would lead you to think. But this is work in progress. Let me just say complete my discussion with the diachrony. So I mentioned that first of all, the standalone focus particle use is a later use. So the third function we saw occurs first in Imperial Latin, and first with the additive reading. The scalar reading is later, apart from occasional context I found in an earlier text. The presupposition, of course, with an additive reading, neither is that what is predicated about an element also holds of its alternatives, whereas the scalar presupposition of a reading like not even leads to an interpretation whereby the alternative, being predicated, so being in focus, is striking with respect to some contextually established scale. We saw likelihood for the baby. The baby is the more likely candidate for purity, and yet, not even him. This, of course, we know it very well from cross-linguistic work. The combination of a scalar reading with negation leads to emphatic negation reading. So it's a negation strengthener, because you're taking a scalar minimum and you are negating it, leading to basically the negation of the entire scale, and leading to so even the most probable alternative in the widest domain you might look at does not hold, and this leads to strengthening of negation. I think this is the reason why these elements end up being morphological components of these Romance indefinites. You see examples here, nec unus, all the way, so you also have neque unus, and you start seeing negative concord here in this very late 9th century text, meaning that probably this kind of strengthening is also a factor leading to redundancy in the expression of negation. This would be the source of ninguno, ni uno, and so on. Last thing I will tell you, if I may. Okay, so I have 1 minute to try to propose the mechanism by which I think that this very important scalar interpretation emerges. Well, first of all, we know that additive particles are systematically ambiguous. So if we have something like, I'm translating, I think, Krifka's example, anche I giganti hanno iniziato in piccolo, even giants started from small beginnings. We are using anche, which is a simple additive particle. Still, we can get a scalar reading. How does this happen? I think this really has to do with the stricter conditions that additive particles impose on the context. We know very well that additive particles need an explicit mention of their alternatives in context. So if you say something like 15, out of the blue, John had dinner in New York too, the kindest reaction you will get is, so what? Because obviously many other people had dinner in New New York. This only makes sense, is informative in the context, if you mention an alternative before. Yesterday, Mary had dinner in New York. And then you can follow with 15, because you had an explicit mention of an alternative in the context, restricting in an informative way the kind of alternatives you are considering. Now, it is impossible to accommodate this kind of alternative for the additive reading. So my proposal here is that if you nonetheless use this particle in a context that doesn't allow for accommodation for the additive reading, you accommodate the scalar reading. So you build a scale out which is suggested by the element in focus. If you have unus, it's very easy. It is the scale of natural numbers. And this kind of accommodation works, and probably by ways we know from mechanism of semantic change, accommodation is costly, and if it becomes systematic enough, so if you force this accommodation frequently enough in your context, then the learner takes this accommodation to be actually part of the literal meaning. So basically changes the presupposition of the particle into a scalar presupposition without the, or in addition to the additive presupposition, or maybe doing without the additive presupposition. There is another system internal factor which plays a role here. I mentioned this particle ne-quidem at the beginning. This used to have a scalar reading, but its syntax is very complicated because it's it has these two parts. So it is not used anymore in late Latin, and it could be that this takes away a blocking effect on this scalar reading for neck. Also consider that ne at the beginning of ne-quidem is very easily mixed with neck. So at some point in late Latin, this happens actually. This is something I already told you, so this is why I think this particle is significant. I just shortly read my conclusions. I analyzed the functions of neck, and I propose that across functions there is a homogeneous internal syntactic structure corresponding to the two basic semantic meanings, components, additivity and negation. The multifunctionality derives from interaction with the surrounding structure, and in turn, the structural attachment of the particle influences the pragmatic properties because the alternatives take the form of the constituent in focus. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was a very nice talk. Again, beautiful transition from the previous one. And I guess I open this for questions.
Maybe just a clarification. I'm not sure if I understood well the baby example, the no one is pure.
Yes.
Is this also an example of a possible accommodation from additive to scalar?
Okay.
And don't we have there a dependence of, doesn't it depend on the determination of the well, maybe in that case, if you have the one or the other? So the question would be, are they, is it vague or is it permissive? So
this one, right?
Yeah.
This was the example you were referring.
Right. Is that what you're saying? You were saying additive or?
Okay,
scalar?
so I think this must be a scalar reading. Yeah, because you're taking basically the endpoint of a scale. Yeah, the scale of likelihood for purity.
When you gloss using an indefinite article, and you don't have an indefinite article in Latin. So, and does this matter? Not if you have not even the infant, you refer to the infant to as to the infant of being part of the group of no one.
So you mean if I had a definite interpretation for infants, this would make a difference?
That for me does.
Okay. But unless the infant is anaphoric with respect to the context, so we are talking about a particular baby, you have a generic interpretation which basically then overlaps, right? Or are you thinking of something different?
Yeah, I'm thinking of, I mean, the infant doesn't fit very well, but normally if you have a definite article, you automatically link it to the quantity which is in the,
yes.
in the first part.
Yes.
And so, and that you don't have that. So is accommodation
So you think this would ease the shift to a scalar reading because you wouldn't have the anaphoric link?
Right.
Okay, I see. Possibly, yeah.
So I have a related question. Do you have any examples that are unambiguously additive?
Unambiguously additive.
That like rule out scalar interpretation?
Yeah. Well, look, it is a very good question because it is hard. I mean, even if you have an alternative in the context, and so you can understand it as additive, a scalar interpretation may kick in. So it is easy to build it because, for instance, the example I gave you for the additive reading, right? So as the first had been sent back, then Mahabal went and neither him was able. Right? So this is additive because I take it as additive because you have the mention of a previous alternative, and in this period, typically this element has a additive semantic. But I actually chose this example because Mahabal is a great general. Yeah, so he's the most obvious candidate to survive the attack, and if he doesn't, so you have a discard even. He couldn't stand. So I guess, well, when I say that the scalar interpretation is later, I'm looking for examples where it can only be scalar. Yeah, but you're perfectly right that many additive instances suggest a scalar interpretation as well.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that was really interesting, I think, as well. And I was interested as well in the fact that if you really take this idea of presupposition accommodation and like quite pragmatic overloads,
yeah, right. Yes.
Seriously, then of course you have the idea that from if you look at it from the outside, you can see there are certain contexts in which the presupposition is impossible to hold, cannot hold anymore. But these, from the analyst's point of view, you would have like some reflex, you would have like some specific context where you could say, okay, the presupposition can't hold there. And I wonder, I didn't really catch it, so do you identify like specific contexts? You could probably have, apart from the general contextual restrictions, you could probably have restrictions like, so there's no previous sentence about this, or I don't know, which context would you, in which context would you be, would you analyze as being particularly relevant for these APO conditions?
Accommodation, yeah. So, well,
non-accommodation.
Yeah. So, if I understand your comment correctly, so one should, of course, start annotating this presupposition. There was a talk previous days by Remus Gagel and his group. They are trying to annotate presuppositions, okay, which is a daunting task on historical texts. And they really use structural indicators. So is it just mentioned in the context? Because, of course, if you say, okay, we can build on word knowledge, or we can build on situational context, which is not necessarily mirrored by the text, starts to be tricky, right? So I would say for me, well, sometimes I allow, of course, for alternatives not to be literally there, but to be suggested by the linguistic context. Yeah, and this is already a little bit tricky. But I always so my criterion was find something which is literally there that can suggest the anaphoric link.
Yeah, but what would that be? Like, which would be the linguistic indicators?
Well, if you have parallelism, which is very typical in these constructions, you are pretty safe, right? And there are other cases. I don't know if
it's ipse, it's not ipse. In this example, it's not ipse what shifts to the scalar interpretation. The occurrence.
It can be, of course, because ipse.
It's a crucial. I mean, the fact that you have ipse brings to the scalar interpretation, because
not necessarily, because ipse is not scalar. Ipse is a centering element, yeah. But of course, it says
but
him
it focuses
in person.
on the and the position of the scale of the subject, which is referred to by ipse. This is the point.
It might very well be, yeah. And I think even word knowledge, the fact that Mahabal is general, yeah, takes us there. Ipse is actually one formative of nessuno, nec ipse unus. So we might expect that that it plays a role in triggering the scalar reading. But so if you have a scalar minimum, you are in trouble, because the scalar minimum always potentially triggers a scalar interpretation. I looked for cases where scalar interpretation was the only possibility. So here I have primis repulsis, and so I say, well, it could be anaphoric. So that's the criterion I use to be sure, that I am not predating the scalar reading too early. But
Yeah, thanks.
I think that brings us in, if we could extend the discussion a tiny bit, so to have the joint discussion on two neg even, Shemki and neg discussion. If you don't mind, I'll just start off with the basic intuition, the basic, very good point you made regarding the birth of scalarity in a way. It's born out of additivity, and I think that was very interesting. Because, for instance, we were talking whether the even component is always structurally present in these expressions, or can it be negotiated, or can it be structurally there? Think of Chiara, right? Justification O versus E. You always have to make a big choice between even or only. You can't, for him, get even out of it, which is what you in a way, in the one reading of additivity, you get.
Yeah, so I just want to add, Hungarian has a lot of little particles that join forces in expressing things that some languages use just one particle for. So in the case of the ish or shem, which can mean either two or even, there is a particular particle that is related to German, I mean, not related, it has a similar semantics as German Loch, that creates the scalar interpretation out of the plain additive one, that it's optional. But so what I really want to say is that so also in English you can get a scalar interpretation just by adding extra focus stress, and so in Hungarian, the particle that is just basically an additive particle can be interpreted as additive and scalar, but with increased stress. But then Hungarian has this extra particle which you can tag on, and then it says, yes, it is scalar. So there is a reality in that sense to the Chiara style analysis, that there is an extra element that can carry the scalar attribution.
What about the role of negation? So I'm not sure I got it then right. What you said about the correlative particles in.
So these sham particles are still negative concord constructions. So both the particle precedes and particle follows construction are still negative concord. So they behave either like Russian nikto or Italian nessuno. So they are themselves are not negative. Yeah.
But they just provide a morphosyntactic indication for the fact that there must be negative operators. But they're not themselves the carrier of these operators.
I mean, yeah, I mean, just like in nessuno, you would assume that the net part is a negation in present day Italian. Right? Yeah. So do you have any possibly any comments on Greek ute, which is similar, but it is not as strict. Yeah, so the interesting thing is, so Gianollo didn't really analyze ute in that context, but so modern Greek is a strict negative concord language, but ute is non-strict item.
Well, look, I have very little to say on the. I know the data are really striking. I have nothing to say on how to analyze this modern Greek situation. What I can say is that when you see the history of negative concord in ancient Greek, so from Homeric to classical Greek, you see that that both ute and ude, which would be really it has the u negative part, but there's another sensitive element. Yeah, it would be more like maybe it's more like but adversative meaning. They really lead to the spread of negative concord. So it looks like it's coordinated particles, maybe just because they are redundant themselves, because they bring in two negations. This happens in Latin, which is a double negation system. But if you systematically have two negations, in some syntactic context, then probably you start having the reading, the logically equivalent reading, where you have a negation of scope of disjunction. And in this case, it means that you have two expressions of negation, but only one interpretation. And I think this is really a factor which favors negative concord. This doesn't tell you, however, much about the modern Greek situation. What would you expect? Because you said, okay, you have two constructions, right? One is quantifier internal. So this is something that maybe we could assume happens in Latin when you have nessuno, so when you incorporate it. What should one look for? So what would be some syntactic determinant of the situation?
I mean, if you know, so I mean, following hierarchy, so nessuno is always in the scope of an independent negation, but so also in the case of the preverbal occurrence, it's according to his analysis in the specifier of his call, the neck head. So that would mean that that neck part is genuinely quantifier internal, right? So which is what everybody thinks, but so it chimes with that.
Related to the word qualunque, these are these very complicated beasts. It seems to have a quay.
Yes.
Not a link. So I think people aren't starving. You all are, I guess. Thanks for coming to this session, and thanks to our speaker, both our speakers. We'll have another discussion. I'll bring it in.